Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora, aloha kako, talofa lava, kia rana, malo e lele, whakatalofa atu, iorana, nisa bula vinaka, halo o keta, good day, half a day, ali, rananim, and warm Pacific welcome to all of you today. My name is Brian Dietrich, and on behalf of the ICTM Oceania Study Group, I offer greetings from Aotearoa and Te Whanganui Atara, known to some as Wellington. As I speak from Aotearoa, I acknowledge the unique role of Māori as tangata whenua, and also the importance of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, recognizing Māori as Tino Rangatiratanga of Aotearoa, New Zealand. To our host collaborators on Zoom, I acknowledge Hawaii as an indigenous place whose original people are native Hawaiians. To those of you from Hawaii, I greet you with thanks, mahalo nui loa. To begin, we open this gathering with uttered poetry as we sound the connections across Te Moana, between here in Aotearoa and north to Hawaii and all in between.
Oi, tana te oro rahi te oro ti, waha te oro ti, wera e tō iriri ana ki ngā tau whare ngā whatumanawa. Tēnā te oro pohonguru e ngā wewe ana ki utai ko miti ana ki tai ko te oro nui, ko te oro roa. Tēnā te pāoro I whakapiki, tēnā te oro take I whakakake. Tēnā te iere atu ana ngā tūpuna I tiki nā tura, I tiki nā tura. I tiki nei te ninihi o te whenua, I tiki nei te whare o te mona, I tiki nei ngā rangi tūhaha, e rongo e me whakanohia ki runga ko te hirangaranga. Whakarongo rā tāne te tokorangi, ki te wheo arau katauri, ki te waiohine, ki te ororuarangi, ki te kōkiri haimata. Whakarongo rā ki te huangunguru, ki te huangongoro, ki te orapari a tangaroa hine moke moke. Pā heko atu ko te tuki ona mata ke hau I te rongo take tū te manawaru, tū te manawaroa, tū te manawaoro. Haungi e, hui e, I taiki e. I breathe, and there is life.
Thank you, Tamihana Katene, for Karakia Oro, your recent composition that sounds the connecting vibration made tangible through taonga puro, Māori instruments, here played on Putorino.
No hoana ke a kua I kana hele I alai ia I ke ki ohu e ka wakoko. E nā kino malu I kalani malu e ho oulu mai ana o laka I kona maukahu o mākou. Hala uei ana e molalei I tala alapanoa ke kula o ku mano kunihika no hoa mau na lahi ho o maha kui ka wei o lua lei. Le ana nuanui ki ka makahala I pau kuia me ka ahihi. I hoʻohihi noho I wau, noho I oe o ko ukule ana pānui, hei ke hao, le helulu lima e te aloha e ai. E ia o ke kilohana ke kona na kamali e huli ana o kohala I maui nei, I nāna nei, ka makani he lau awa o pi o oi mani. Helu aku nā pū apeli ai o pū wā, o pū ano hulu, o pili no me kalahiki ola, I ke ka mokunui la o Hawaii. Ke kau nei o Hawaii luna mehelu pe ala kalele oni ke po o kaina nā pele o pula ka mahale ho haaku ke ala pula. Nui tau ala e ui hua kamalama e hei ke haole he lulu lima e te aloha e Hei ke Hawaii, he honi no te aloha e, aloha e, aloha e, aloha e. Ka welina o ke aloha me o kou pakahi a pau, welina I ke ia aha o ka Oceania Study Group o ka ICTM. Aloha.
Thank you, Aaron Salah, for voicing our connections from Hawaii with Pule and Mele, and for opening a pathway for us across Te Moana. Mahalo nui loa to you, Aaron. Kia ora, Tamihana and Aaron. And now I will invite some opening remarks from Richard Vostik, President, East-West Center, and our host organization for this event. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Brian, for this opportunity to welcome everyone online to this really extraordinary event. First of all, on behalf of my colleagues at the East-West Center, a hearty aloha. I'm currently in the office to be with good Wi-Fi and at the mouth of Manoa Valley here in Honolulu. But I realize that many of you are scattered all over the region, and I thank you, whatever your time zone is, for joining us today. We at the East-West Center are really pleased to host this virtual symposium of the ICTM study group on music and dance of Oceania. And we are thrilled, really, as was mentioned in our earlier conversation, to welcome a record number of attendees to this gathering. You know, as president of the East-West Center, I have the opportunity to welcome people to many events at the East-West Center. But at this one, I am humbled to have 3 generations of key players in the East-West Center's cultural attention, interest, and promotion of music, dance, theater, and so forth across Asia Pacific, Oceania, and beyond. On this call here in Hawaii, we have Barbara Smith, Emeritus Professor at UH and a very good friend of the East-West Center. Rick Tremilos, the second generation, you might say, of the ethnomusicology programs and leadership at the University of Hawaii, and also another long-term friend of the East-West Center. And of course, our own Eric Chang, who is kind of third generation, following in the footsteps of more than 60 years of East-West Center attention to this part of the world and its rich, rich diversity of cultures. One of the silver linings of this pandemic, I guess, has been the leveraging of online connectivity to cross borders and boundaries, giving everyone greater access to knowledge and discourse. We've been helped, of course, in the last few years by the expansion of undersea cables across the Pacific, which has made these virtual gatherings even more possible. And we look forward to continuing hybrid programs going forward so we can have a broader and broader array of participation in the events that we hold here at the East-West Center, University of Hawaii, and with all our colleagues and friends around the region. We have a long history of evaluating Pacific Island peoples, cultures, and connections. This is another example of it. It happens in our research program and our professional development, in our arts program, and our student programs, and our convening activities, all kind of integrated into what we hope is a transformative experience for the people who come to the East-West Center, not just because the center is a wonderful gathering place in this wonderful, beautiful island, because of the beauty of the people who come together and to share their experiences, their hopes and aspirations. I wish all of you a fruitful and engaging weekend of insightful presentations and dialogue. I thank you to give thanks also to all our organizing partners and all participants for your interest, your work, contributions, and real dedication to gathering a large ohana of people together in an environment like this, even though it's virtual, with still no abdication of spirit, but quite the contrary, increased dedication to the interconnectivity that makes us appreciate the good fortune to be human in this part of the world, and with such a wide range of fascinating friends, colleagues, and practitioners in arts and music. A sincere mahalo to all of you. May you have every success in this next few days and going forward. And remember, the East-West Center is a place where we welcome not only the ICTM, but all the other sorts of programs that deal with culture and languages and music and so on in this part of the world. Thank you for coming. And again, I'll turn it back over to our organizers for the next step. Mahalo.
Mahalo, mahalo nui loa, Richard. And now from the music department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, words of aloha from Professor of Ethnomusicology, Jane Freeman Mulan.
Aloha kako. On behalf of the Ethnomusicology program at the University of Hawaii, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium offered by the study group on the music and dance of Oceania. As we open this event, I would like to take the time to acknowledge Hawaii as an indigenous place where the descendants of the original people today identify as Kanaka Maoli. The aina or land on which the university is located is in the Ahupua'a of Waikiki, in the Moku of Kona, and on the Mokopuni or island of Oahu. And the land on which the music department sits is the Ili Aina, the land division of Pa'akea. Acknowledging these traditional Vahipana or place names grounds our work. It honors the Aina, the historic relationship that Native Hawaiians have with this place, and the generations of Kanaka Maoli who have shaped, maintained, and cared for Hawaii. The university has a very special relationship with the study group, and those of us here have many fond memories of the last time we hosted a meeting back in 2006. We were so looking forward before COVID struck to meeting you all here once again in Honolulu. My hearty congratulations to Brian and the others for doing everything possible to ensure that we could meet in spite of the little delay and the fact that we can't do that face to face. I'm just delighted to see so many of you here today. The study group meeting is very important for all that concerns Pacific music and dance. And the research presented here reflects the current concerns of Pacific communities and Pacific researchers. It looks like an interesting and full program has been planned over the next few days. And I join with Music Department Chair Larry Paxton in wishing all of you warm wishes for a stimulating and productive meeting. Yaurana e maibaya oto. Maururu.
Mahalo nui loa, Jane. And from here at Te Herengawaka, Victoria University in Wellington, brief words of welcome from Professor Sally Jane Norman, Director of Te Koki, the New Zealand School of Music.
Kia ora and warm Pacific greetings from Te Koki, New Zealand School of Music here at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. I'm Sally Jane Norman, the Director, and wanted to add our voice to this welcome for this wonderful event. We're really wishing you days of exciting music and dance and connections that will last well beyond through our deeply shared Oceania music and dance legacies.
Thank you, Sally Jane. To all, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our 10th symposium, and I'm delighted to see all of you here. A special warm welcome to those new to this group, and we hope that you will find our work of interest. I encourage everyone now to write a short message in the chat box with a greeting and letting us know from where you are zooming in. For those new to this group, please consider joining our parent organization, the International Council for Traditional Music, which hosts members in 122 countries. ICTM is an important voice for music and dance globally. For our symposium schedule over the next 4 days, a program book with abstracts is available on our website, which I've just linked to on the chat box, where you will find information about the study group and our biannual newsletter. A reminder too that this symposium is being recorded by East-West Center. As we all know, our symposium in 2019 was postponed. By the end of 2020, I was very pleased that members expressed a strong interest in meeting virtually to carry forward our planned program, and now online, we can open our symposium in ways before not possible. Through our presentations, but also our Zoom format, our webinar remix, we have titled the symposium, Connecting Oceania Through Music and Dance. The challenges of COVID-19 remain with us globally, and this, together with a range of time zones and a wish to avoid Zoom fatigue, have prompted us to organize short sessions across each day. We are delighted to see representation in the symposium from across the region. As a link with the original 2020 planning, a panel on day 2 will address the pioneering work of Barbara Smith in Micronesia. Day 3 of the program focuses on 2 roundtable sessions, the first newly organized to address issues from COVID-19, and the second on Asia-Pacific connections. For day 4, our party, we will launch a new book in celebration of Adrian Kepler, past president of ICTM. The publication, called Perspectives in Motion, Engaging the Visual and Dance and Music, addresses Adrian's contributions over 5 decades of scholarship. Adrian, congratulations, and we look forward to celebrating with you later in the symposium. Speaking of parties, at the end of session 2 today, we will keep Zoom open for an informal gathering and for anyone who just wants to say hello. So please join us there. As chair of the Oceania Study Group, I thank my collaborators on the program committee, Irene, Karongo, Hundleby, and Ruben Brown. The study group is grateful to local arrangement advisors, Eric Chang and Rick Tremilos, and our sincere thanks to the staff at the East-West Center for seamlessly transferring our gathering to virtual format. The study group acknowledges Barbara Smith for supporting this meeting with an open registration. We also note our gratitude to the New Zealand School of Music, Te Koki at Victoria University of Wellington, and the Ethnomusicology Program and Music Department of the University of Hawaii at Manoa. There are more people to thank, especially for the book launch on day 4, but I'll save those for later and the surprises. As we all gather together across our screens, my heartfelt thanks to all participants, presenters, chairs, performers, and listeners for enthusiastically supporting our program and for bringing greater advocacy to the music and dance of Oceania. I hope that you will find interest in our program and presentations as we make connections with each other globally through music and dance. Kia ora. And now we are ready to move on to the first session of the program. And with that, I would like to introduce the chair of the first session. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Rick Tremilos, who will be known to many here. Rick is Professor Emeritus in Asian Studies and in Ethnomusicology at the University of Hawaii. Importantly, Rick is also, of course, the founder of the Oceania Study Group and has held various roles in ICTM. And because of that, it's a special honor to have you here opening this first session, Rick. Mahalo nui loa.
Mahalo. Aloha kākou. Welcome to panel 1, Performance and Listening Experiences. The 3 papers will be presented without pause, followed by general discussion. To submit questions for discussion, please use the chat function addressed to everyone. Now at this time, please be sure you have muted yourself using the button on the lower left of the screen. Our first presenter is Kati Sego from Memorial University of Newfoundland, who will speak on Listening with a Hula Dancer's Body. Please welcome Kati.
Hello.
A staff member at the Ministry of Justice, Communication and Foreign Affairs in Tuvalu, and Tala Samiti, an independent researcher with a graduate degree from City University in London. Unfortunately, Tala cannot be present, so Jessica will present their paper, Movement and Success in Tuvalu's Contemporary Music Industry. This is Jessica Marinaccio.
I'm muted, now I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Yes,
okay.
Sorry. Hi everyone, just signing in from Funafuti here, so if there is any droppage or anything, I do apologize, but I think the internet should be stable. I'm just gonna go right into the PowerPoint so as not to go over time. Just share, sorry. Okay. All right, I'll put this on with time. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yep, okay, great. All right, so I'm very excited to be here today. I will apologize for, oh, and I also just have to say, as a matter of course, anything that is in this presentation does not represent the views or opinions of the government of Tuvalu. Okay, that's out of the way. So I have to apologize on behalf of my co-author, Tala. He does a lot of photography and videography work, and he's out in the Northern Islands now where the connectivity is not as good, doing some projects on Ridge to Reef. So we have lost him, but we have me, and we did the PowerPoint together, so it should be okay. One thing, I'm exactly at 15 minutes, so I'm not going to be able to play any music. But what I would encourage, if you want to hear the music, just write that in the chat as your question, and I can play you lots of songs. So today I'm going to be talking about movement and success in Tuvalu's contemporary music industry. The movement here does not represent physical movement, but more the movement of songs, how they've moved throughout the Pacific. So just by way of introduction, and then why we looked at this topic. In 2018, Tala was studying his master's in the UK, and I was in New Zealand studying for my PhD. And he had messaged me noting that he was using Spotify a lot in the UK, and he noticed that Samoan, Tongan, Fijian popular music were all on Spotify, but Tuvaluan popular music, so more reggae music, was not on Spotify. And he was asking, he thinks Tuvaluan popular music is just as good as these other countries, so why is it not up there? Why aren't Tuvaluan musicians making money off of their music on platforms like Spotify? At the same time, when I'm in New Zealand, there's a music platform called Music Tuvalu. They run through Facebook and through YouTube. They post a lot of Tuvaluan songs. They've been around since about 2013. But in 2018, they start to plan the first concert of popular Tuvaluan musicians ever, I think, in New Zealand. And so they invite people from Tuvalu, people based in Fiji, and then many people based in New Zealand. And one of the main goals that they stated for this was that they wanted to promote popular Tuvaluan music and make it more economically successful. So just based on Tala's question about why isn't Tuvaluan music on Spotify, and then this platform in New Zealand thinking that they really needed to do a lot of work to make popular Tuvaluan music more successful, we started thinking, well, why do people think that this music is not successful? Is it not successful? Or are these problems of definition? Maybe how we define success is different in different places. So that's where we're coming from. This is one of the pictures from the Music Tuvalu concert that happened in Auckland in 2019. So just you can kind of see the scale of the concert there. We're kind of, because of COVID-19, I'm blaming everything on COVID-19 right now. We're kind of in early days with writing up this research. So I'm just going to give some basics on what we've been looking at. Our research questions, we have one very broad one, which is what is the current state of popular Tuvaluan music? This is really important, although it's huge, because nobody has written, people have barely written about quote unquote traditional Tuvaluan music fatele. No one has written about popular Tuvaluan music. So doing a lot of the background work on what is the history, who thinks who is popular, who's famous, that took a lot of work. The other question we really focused on was what I explained before. What does it mean to be a successful Tuvaluan musician in different locations? So we asked people in New Zealand, I did a lot of work there, and then people in Tuvalu and in Fiji based there. What does it mean for you to be successful as a musician? To see if people had different definitions and what people were focusing on as an indicator of success. So for methodology, we are very lucky that Tuvalu is small. So there's only one media company and they have almost all of the songs. So we were able to, I think, get about 1,200 songs from the media, popular music songs from the 50s up till now. So that was really useful for a lot of our work. We also conducted 63 semi-structured interviews with Tuvaluan musicians in Tuvalu, New Zealand, and Fiji. So those are all transcribed. Everything is done with that. We just kind of need to write at this point. So today what I'm going to talk about briefly is just the current state of contemporary music. And I'll get in trouble with terminology and you can yell at me. Popular, contemporary, I know they're different, but whatever, I'll explain. Contemporary music industry in Tuvalu, because I'm sure that people do not really know what's going on with music in Tuvalu. So that would be a good thing to explain. How contemporary music travels from Tuvalu in the Pacific and to other countries. If it's not on Spotify, how is it moving around? How has it moved around throughout time? and then meanings of success in music from the perspectives of popular musicians in Tuvalu. But first, this is my favorite part, current state of contemporary music industry in Tuvalu, very fascinating. So in 2019, when we did most of our interviews, there are approximately 5 popular music bands in Funafuti, in the capital. And when I say popular music bands, it's usually younger people, mostly men. They play reggaeton, reggae, or rap music. Always will have vocals and keyboards, usually guitar and bass. If they have drums, that's like a big get. If you have drums, you are a very popular band. People will want you to play for them. So there were 5 of these bands. Women usually show up as singers in these bands, but rarely is there somebody who is like a staple member of a band who's a woman. There are also 3 folk style bands. We've put the folk style, that's more string band type. We've put that here as popular music because, sorry, I feel like there's a chat that I need to read. The folk style string bands we've left out here because they don't really represent the traditional fatele type of music. So we put them in with the popular music. What's really interesting is that a lot of the time the popular music bands come out of the folk style string bands. The string bands are usually kava clubs, so big groups of guys who get together every night to drink kava, play string music, and then they also will play for government events. And the younger people who are part of these groups will want to do their own music. And so they'll start bands coming out of these kava clubs. So they're all very much connected to each other. There are also a number of solo musicians, as well as 4 to 5 sound engineers who are very important because they do all the mixing and the beats for almost all of the songs in Tuvalu. So they produce all of the music. At the same time, when we were doing the interviews, there were a number of solo musicians operating in Fiji and New Zealand, but not really any bands. So not really any Tuvaluan bands in those countries. What is fascinating is as of 2020, when I got stuck here due to the lockdown, all of Tuvalu's popular music bands, except for 1, have stopped performing publicly. And we're not really sure why. There's only 1 that's playing right now, and they're making a lot of money because nobody else is playing music. And just for how people make money off of popular music in New Zealand and in Tuvalu, the 2 main locations we looked at. In New Zealand, there's a lot more focus on recording and making money through internet platforms, if possible. Whereas in Tuvalu, it's mostly live performances. People perform for weddings, government functions, birthdays, and that's how they make a lot of their music. But that also means they're largely cover bands. So that's one of the things, they're not playing their own music, they'll play other people's music to make money. So this is just a picture of somebody, a Tuvaluan recording music in New Zealand, and then some live performances from Tuvaluan bands, a reggae band and a rap band in Tuvalu. So then just quickly looking at how contemporary music has traveled from Tuvalu to other places. The coolest part about this is that probably from the 70s to the 1990s, the way that Tuvaluan music was mostly circulated around the Pacific, but circulated quite widely, was people just sending tapes and CDs back and forth to each other. So as families would be separated, Tuvaluans would move out of Tuvalu to other places, they would just start sending music to each other, especially if the family was musical or a band had separated. So half the band was in Tuvalu, the other half in New Zealand. They would start to send their music back and forth. And that's how a lot of the music people know about a lot of the music from the 80s and the 90s, is just because it was sent through mail. But it was also sent another way. So a big player in Tuvaluan popular music we have found is seafarers. So people who have been involved in shipping and seafaring, they transferred a lot of tapes and CDs from different locations. They also had a lot more money than other Tuvaluans in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So they actually formed a lot of the first Tuvaluan bands. Seafarers could buy instruments. They also were on boats for long periods of time. So they would just end up forming bands with people on their boat. And then they would play when they got into Funafuti, into the capital. Now you don't see that as much, but what you do see is people who were involved in seafaring or shipping before, they still have a lot of money. So they're the sponsors for a lot of the bands we have today. They'll purchase the instruments and equipment for a lot of the bands. So that's a really interesting part of just how Tuvaluan music has become known throughout the Pacific in the early days. So this is just a quote from Eddie Alama in New Zealand. He was a member of one of the most popular Tuvaluan bands in New Zealand. And he talked about when they became popular in the 90s, the only way people back home could hear their music was they would just burn CDs and send them back to Tuvalu. But in Tuvalu now, the media has all of their recordings. They don't have any of their own recordings in New Zealand. So only the media here in Tuvalu has recordings of their songs, which is really interesting because they sent it all back. And this is me and Eddie. Okay, and so then how contemporary music travels today, it's pretty much the way you would expect. It's not on Spotify really or those type of sites, but it's mostly through YouTube. People send music through email, via Facebook Messenger. There was a song that just went viral a couple of days ago here in Funafuti that was sent, just everyone sent it to each other through Messenger. It was against the government. That's why people like the song. And YouTube is a major way that the songs will travel. From the singers we talked to, the major places that their songs will get played aside from Tuvalu, Kiribati and the Marshall Islands, big places where Tuvaluan music is popular, but also Fiji, New Zealand, Samoa. And then from my own experience, if there's any diaspora community, places like Taiwan, you'll also hear Tuvaluan music wherever usually Tuvaluans are going. So this is just a picture of one really popular Tuvaluan singer, Philo, her cover of the song Just an Illusion. And it's up on YouTube. And if you look down at the comments, there's people from Tonga and other places who are commenting on her song and that they like the cover that she's done. And so finally, the last thing that we were looking at is meanings of success in popular Tuvaluan music. We focused our two major groups, musicians in New Zealand and those based in Tuvalu. We asked them questions about what they thought it meant to be successful in music. The basic conclusion we've drawn here is very cliched, so we're going to have to look into it a little bit more. But mostly that the musicians based in New Zealand were very focused on making money. So if you make money off of your music as a Tuvaluan, you are successful. The musicians in Tuvalu was very different. It seems like it's related, but it ended up being quite different. They really focused on how widely music was circulated. If your music is played all over the capital, all over Tuvalu, all over the Pacific, then you're successful. Not necessarily if you make money, because it being circulated widely may have nothing to do with how much money you make off of the song. So they were much more focused on if everyone in Funafuti knows my song or knows someone else's song, that person is a successful musician. There also were musicians in the capital who really looked forward to organizing. They thought if all the musicians could come together to form an association, that would mean that they could move towards actually making money. So some of the problem with success not being correlated with commercial success may be because there's not enough organization for people to think about that. So just some quotes. I have two, one from Romy Kofe in New Zealand, and then one from Sona Alofa. They're both singers, and both of them had very similar descriptions of success in music, both saying that, you know, if you want to compare how many people listen to a song and how much money someone makes off of a song, the person who makes more money is more successful. We say we do it because we love it, but what is more important in the end is the money we make off of it. Not everyone in New Zealand said this. So another singer, Rosie Lemenko, she really focused on the circulation of music, but a lot of people in New Zealand were very focused on if we can make money from our music as Tuvaluans, then we're successful. If we come to people based in Tuvalu, what people really were looking at is how widely music was circulated with no reference to money being made off of it. So one of the string bands, Karongo Malipolipo, they were talking about a competition. They had lost this song competition, but then after that, their song was actually played most widely of all the songs entered into the competition. So to them, this meant that they were most successful. Their music was more successful than even the winner of the competition who had made money off of it. And this is Karongo Malipolipo with Tala. Then another singer, Naomi, she pointed out that she thought another singer, Takashi, was very, very successful because his music had gone viral in the Pacific. But of course, the way it went viral was on YouTube. So there really wasn't any earnings to Takashi off of this going viral. And then a sound engineer, Mr. Daniel, basically just saying that he didn't think Tuvaluan music was successful at all because when he went abroad, he's an observer on fishing boats, he hears Solomon Island songs, Kiribati songs in other countries, but he never hears Tuvaluan songs. So he doesn't think that Tuvaluan music is very successful. And then one of the music groups, Tubamba, basically talking about how they really think Tuvaluans in Tuvalu need to organize to better promote their music. And this is one of their members talking with Tala. So just in conclusion, these are early days. We'll get more nuanced as we go. But when we were looking at popular musicians based in Tuvalu, there was a lot of interest in the promotion of music, but people did not correlate that with how much money they were making. And the thing we were looking at the reasoning for this is that if you make a lot of money off of music, popular music in Tuvalu, it's because you play live performances, which usually means you're playing cover music, cover songs. So your original music being successful is not correlated with how much money you're making, because you make money by playing usually other people's music, so other popular music at government functions and other things. The other kind of conclusion we came up with, and that we're looking at more now for writing, is that Tuvaluan music is just a very rich field for study because it hasn't been looked at. There are really classic Pacific studies issues, problems of identity in Tuvaluan music. There was a lot of tension between Tuvaluan musicians in Tuvalu and those based in New Zealand, based on who's really a Tuvaluan musician. Are those in New Zealand actually Tuvaluan musicians? Like that kind of classic debate. Issues of copyright infringement, both that people in Tuvalu said they didn't really understand laws about how their music was being used on YouTube. Other people would post it, and that was infringing on their copyright rights, but nobody knows enough about it to do anything. But also that a lot of very popular Tuvaluan music in Tuvalu is heavily copied from Western music usually. So then there are a lot of people who are questioning even if there is any original Tuvaluan popular music. That was something that came up a lot. And then finally, just the need to document the general history of Tuvaluan music, that there's so much that's gone on since the 50s to now. And so that's something that we really want to look at in the future. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jess. Audience members, please be thinking about questions to post on chat after our final speaker. Our final speaker is Irene Karongo Handleby, an independent scholar with roots in the Solomon Islands and in New Zealand, where she completed her doctorate at the University of Otago. She shares her presentation, Barasili Custom Dance Performance and Transformation in Malaita, Solomon Islands. This is Irene Karongo Handleby.
Halawhi Diana Fulgamolu. Today I am presenting this video, pre-recording it for you from Auckland, New Zealand. Sadly, I'm not able to be with you this weekend as I have family that is very unwell, so I have to be with family at the moment. But I really do hope that this presentation resonates with you and that you learn a little along the way and that it sparks some lively conversation as well following. Sorry, I won't be able to be with you for question and answer sessions. So my name is Dr. Irene Karongo Handleby. I'm an ethnomusicologist, and my talk today is about my family and my tribe and my people of Laubailalea, Northeast Malaita, Solomon Islands. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about Barasili. It's a dance music form that we have at home, and about its transformation over time. Today you will hear a brief selection of our stories, songs and history from Laubailalea and our thinking. In North Malaita, family is everything. As young children, we Solomon Islanders are taught to look up to our elders, to listen to the things that our grandparents say, and to learn from their messages. We, my siblings and I, are descendants of both Lau and Bailalea clans. As one of the eldest in our generation, my mum and my dad, but my mum being from this area, readied me for the life I now lead. From a young age, I was taught to listen to our stories, to understand our values, and to learn our genealogies and our histories. I was gifted a sense of responsibility and obligation to be there for our clans, to honour our ancestors, and to understand the connections and responsibilities we have as guardians of our lands and our seas. So my doctoral research and the work we have done together since is an extension of those responsibilities. Since 2014, our elders, members of our clans and community groups have worked together to collect music, dance, stories and histories. As toi tolu, people of the bush, in Bailalea, and as Toyasi, people of the sea, in Lau Lagoon. So our methods have been fashioned to mirror Indigenous ways of thinking and to ensure we respect our communities, our ancestors, and that we continue to protect our private knowledge. To date, we have recorded hundreds of practice sessions, performances, art-making sessions, stories and histories, as individuals and in groups. And our greatest goal is to continue to teach our youth, to share our music and our arts, so that our histories will not be forgotten. There is still much work to be done, and despite our separation during this COVID-19 era, musical practice and performance continues. So it is important that you know today that what you hear today is collective knowledge passed on from our elders during our research process, and also knowledge I have learnt from my elders throughout the past 47 years of my life. Here in this slide, you see 3 elders that were heavily involved with my research, in particular on the left here, Tete Lucy Bakalei, one of my mums, she's my mum's sister by birth. And a lot of my early study was documenting the music of our women. So women feature heavily in what you will hear today as well. So I guess we begin with, what is Barasili? Barasili is a custom cultural art form incorporating North Malaitan narrative, song, and dance, performed in public spaces by groups of 8 to 12 people or more. Although Barasili includes both dance and song, in a Malaitan context, dance and song are not thought of as separate entities. In Barasili, movement is integral to the music, and the music is reliant on movement. Ngu, songs, and unu, stories, are integral to our dance forms. Each cannot exist without the other. At the heart of any dance or song is what we would term a custom story or a narrative. The custom story is always connected to a particular clan, and significantly, clan members collectively own their stories. Our Barasili songs are considered gifts from our ancestors, familial gifts that connect us to our past and continue our traditions into contemporary 21st century Malaita. Prior to the introduction of Christianity in the 20th century, almost all of our songs and dances were performed only by men, and they were performed as part of Indigenous spiritual worship or for community feasting events, such as Mauma, which were funerary ceremonies, which also held spiritual significance. So our dances were historically held to entertain the guests and the ghosts. In the 1930s, a Tol Baita descendant discussed the concept of pleasing the ghosts, akalo or agalo, to Hogbin. In the hills, we carry out funerary rites, sacrifices and dances to please the akalo, the spirits. We exchange weeping, pigs and dancing for their goodwill. Then they give us what we ask. Just as in theory, people do not weep because they are sorry, so also that they do not dance for enjoyment. They weep and rejoice only to please the spirits. Told to Hogbin in 1939. So historically, women were prohibited from dancing, as dancing was a spiritual act performed to please the agalo, the spirits, and to influence mamana, or spiritual protection. This was due to the belief that women were sua, that is, they had feminine power. The ability to give birth and shed menstrual blood gave women the power to neutralize all things sacred. In contrast, men, in particular, Watabu, high priests, were able to communicate directly with the spirits and were considered to be spiritually clean. There was only one dance, danced by women alone, the Awimaku, the dance of the cloth, performed for the death of a great chief. So spiritual dance of the past in Lao Bailalea had rigid rules and boundaries that focused on presenting a pleasing performance to the spirits. However, dance of today, while still keeping in mind a supernatural audience, is no longer performed as part of Indigenous ceremonial rituals. Instead, there is greater focus on entertaining the living in a variety of contexts and spaces. Today in North Malaita, Barasili may be performed by anyone. Men, women, and youth, an increasing number of groups are engaged in the teaching, learning, and performance of the genre. In contemporary settings, these dances are performed for special school or church occasions, such as cultural days, graduations, and religious Christian feast days. So today, I've chosen 3 Barasili songs to highlight transformation in relation to our Ngali Nut festivals. Traditionally, Ngali Nut festivals were annual feasting occasions where our families would come together to harvest nali nuts. Entire villages would gather, collect, crack, and feast to celebrate the harvest. As Malaitan life has become more influenced by other ways of being, some of our old traditions, such as nali nut feasts, have been lost. The nali nut, Canarium almond, is favoured as the nut of choice in our region for its distinct and pleasing taste. One of our most popular dishes contains nali nut roasted in bamboo containers over a fire, added to smashed blackened taro to make gata. So this first example is what we call a hereria horurua. It's a nali nut cracking festival song performed in the traditional manner of years ago when our ancestors would crack nuts. So this first song is a traditional tune originally performed as part of the Nut Cracking Festival. The second example is a narrative song performed by our Auntie Tusi Mama. She sings a song in a narrative style to tell a family story using another hereria horurua tune. So in this example, we hear this custom tune as pre-Christianity. The traditional melody contains large intervals. The verses, however, tell a clan story. This narrative song is similar to a book. It holds cultural knowledge, and songs are ideal ways to pass knowledge between generations. Finally, this third example is a hereria horurua hymn, performed in custom dance style, complete with whālaki, ankle rattles, and kisikisi, hand rattles. However, it is done in a church as a Christian hymn. this final version of hymn is a great example of modern hybridity in our music. Hymn lyrics communicate relatively modern Christian messages. Custom dance replicates traditional spiritual dances of the past, the style of dance previously performed by men in sacred rituals and also as part of those funerary feasts, Mauma, that I spoke about earlier. So despite all this transformation that we see through our music, from a North Malayan perspective, the most important aspect, whether contemporary or traditional, is North Malaitans, for us North Malaitans, is being connected as family. Music and the arts reveal how we live as connected people, as family, as clans, as communities. For us, our music connects us as we play, sing, and make together. Music connects us to our ancestors, which is a clear part of our historic Vaidasili, through our traditional tunes and instruments, and our traditional dress and costumes. We sing and dance not only for the living, but for the family members that have passed, for our ancestors. Our instruments call the ancestors in and invite them to be present with us. Our traditional dress is often passed on through generations, made by members of our families, and also this reminds us of our cultural heritage. Our metaphors and our symbols reference our environments, our animals, and we dance with our sacred plants. Music and the arts help us to express our Lao-Bailali identities and nurture our relationships. The arts provide a way for us to give, receive, learn, and share together. And if we are serious about sustaining our cultures and our histories, we must continue to tell our stories, to dance our dances, to create the new and to reimagine the old, to share and teach who we were in the past, and to share who we are in this present moment. Thank you. Ragutamas, Roxiana. Good night.
Thanks to Irene. I'm sorry that she wasn't able to actually be with us in Zoom. We have a bit of a time problem. We're running a little bit over, so we can't take as many questions as we had hoped. But let's start with the ones that have been posted. The first one is for Jess, so if you could unmute yourself, Jess. And the question was from Patrick Savage. Curious whether getting on Spotify by itself would help Tuvaluan musicians make money. And then he goes on to say, my understanding of their artist payment model is that it's pretty exploitative and you have to have a mega hit to actually make decent money. Jess, could you respond to that?
Yeah, no, I think the idea that Spotify is the way to make money off of music, or that you can even make a lot of money off of recording right now is very problematic. But I think that just the idea that that's what people think, like if it's on Spotify, that means you're making money, that just served to show us that people were starting to look at, you know, why is Tuvaluan music not making money? So more of an indicator of that problem.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a lot to talk about. I mean, there's a lot to just discuss with that, the whole business of the commercialization. But thanks, and we'll go on and try to hit as many questions as we can. The next question is for Kati from Keola on Maui. And he refers to your previous research and says, I'm wondering if there was any mention from your students of the words or the feelings of the mele being the impetus for their kinesthetic reactions. And he goes on to say that he thought that the students at Kamehameha would have enough of a Hawaiian vocabulary to know most of the words of the song Pulamana. So Kati, could you unmute yourself and respond to Keola? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't looked at the whole data set for a long time, but, and this was 30 years ago. I'm focusing right now on movement, but my recollection is that there was not a lot of word-centered meaning that was attributed or drawn from from Puamana. Sorry, to be more specific, it wasn't specifically word-centered. So, but it's not as though students who knew the song did not also know the general meaning of the song. So for example, Leah, whose drawing I showed you, she was very cognizant of the words. She knew very well that this was a song that had been written about the Farden family home in Lahaina. And in fact, her own grandmother had a beachside home in Lahaina, and Leah herself had learned to dance Puamana on that beachside. So, so yes, I would say that the meanings of words were significant to students, but it was the general meaning of the song. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Kati. We have actually time for one more question, if somebody has one. If you could indicate. Yes, Brian has a question.
Thank you, Rick. Just a quick question for Jess. Jess, you had mentioned, and thank you for your presentation. You had mentioned collecting these or going through these recordings from Tuvalu, and I think you mentioned from the 1950s onward, which sounds really amazing. And I was just wondering if you could tell us, is that stored at the radio station or is there a local archive there? I'm asking in part just because in my experiences in the FSM, recordings from the 50s are quite rare. You get them from the 70s onward or late 60s, but just a little bit about how those are kind of kept there.
Yeah, 50s and 60s, yeah, not very many, like one or two. And then mostly, like you said, from the 70s on. But it is kept all at the Tuvalu media, and they just keep them for their own radio broadcast. So it's not actually archived. And there was some problem with the power going out while there are two archives, I think, and the power went out on one. And then they were being like, yeah, we should really start to back these up. And we're like, yeah, maybe. So we ended up getting another copy. So I think we now have like the third archive of all of the songs with the power back on.
Well, great, thank you. It sounds like a really wonderful resource to tap into, and you're coming at the right time to do that work. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. Unfortunately, our time for discussion in session 1 has come to an end. However, you can send private chats to the speakers for further interaction if you wish. So at this time, though, please join me in thanking Kati Sego, Jess Manaccio, and Irene Karongo Handleby for getting us off on a good start. And session 2 will begin shortly, due in 1 minute, but it may take a little bit longer. So thank you again for your attention and for your joining us for this first session. Mahalo.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Rick. And we're just about to move into session 2. So thank you to Rick and all presenters in session 1. It's my pleasure to introduce the chair of session 2. Keola Donaghy is Assistant Professor of Music at the University of Hawaii at Maui College and the Faculty Coordinator of Music Studies and the Institute of Hawaii. He serves on the Board of Governors of the Hawaii Academy of Recording Arts. Keola also serves as webmaster and listserv manager for the Oceania Study Group. So it's also really wonderful to have you here, Keola. Mahalo nui loa.
Oh, mahalo ya oi, Brian. Aloha pumihana kako, kena koutou katoa. We'll jump right into it. Our panel is entitled Historical Consciousness in Music and Dance. And as Rick laid out earlier, we will go through the 3 panelists and hold questions till the end. Panelists, I will send you a message as we approach the deadline for your finishing off. So our first presenter is the esteemed Amy Ku'ulealoha Stillman, and her presentation is Indigenous Cosmopolitanism and Multiple Literacies in Hawaiian Sheet Music, applying tune itinerary methodologies to Ipule Manu and Pua Melekule. Amy.
Mahalo Keola. Aloha. Aloha iai kako wapo. I'm speaking to you from my home in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's the ancestral land of the Anishinaabe peoples, whose gift of land to establish the University of Michigan gave rise to the institution that has been my academic home for the past several decades. Okay, and let me, eeps. Uh-oh. Okay. So I'm screen sharing now, so there we go. Oops. Let's see. Okay. Go away. Okay, here we go. The anthropological study of music and dance traditions has a long history of privileging practice over repertoire and ethnographic field research over historical source studies. My approach in this paper runs counter to that current by centering the study of repertoire. However, I do so in order to tack between practice and repertoire as both unfold over time. My objective, in this paper, I use as a case study a sheet music folio published in Honolulu in 1892. My objective is to track an indigenous Hawaiian praxis of cosmopolitanism by uncovering the agency flowing continuously beneath the decades of intercultural encounters and social transformations wrought on and by Hawaiians over the 19th century. The sheet music folio at the center of this study contains two songs, Ipolei Manu and Puamele Kule. Notice that the term hula ku'i appears beneath each song title. The term is repeated on the individual scores within, again placed directly beneath each song title. The publication of this sheet music was heralded in a brief notice in the Evening Bulletin on June 18th of 1892 as follows, quote, "The bulletin acknowledges the receipt of the music and words of two hula ku'is, Ipolei Manu and Puamele Kule, the first ever printed." Ipolei Manu, literally beloved lei of feathers, has a particularly poignant history for Native Hawaiian people, Kanaka Maoli people. It is a love song written by Queen Kapi'olani for her husband, King Kalakaua, when he was abroad in San Francisco seeking medical treatment. He passed while abroad and thus never heard her song. Puamele Kule, literally marigold blossoms, has a less straightforward history. Although the dedicatee is not known, Queen Liliuokalani included an English translation in the 1897 manuscript of her songs that she was preparing for publication. My analysis in search of indigenous Hawaiian praxis, I engaged two methodological toolkits. The first is a device that I call the Tune Itinerary, which I developed in the course of compiling a musicological critical edition of Hawaiian repertoire. The second is genealogical analysis of the conditions of possibility in the emergence of the hula ku'i, which informs interpretations of hula ku'i practice in the late 19th century with evidence that is textual but not sonic. The tune itinerary is a mapping of a tune across space and time. Once a song is brought into existence, where does it go? What do we learn from both the journeys and the destinations that a tune travels? Tracking tunes begins with old-fashioned bibliographic searching for instances of dissemination and documentation. My search covered print media, which included instances of song lyrics as well as notated scores. My search extended into sound recordings as well. The tune itinerary, then, is not simply one or more lists of the tune as printed or sung or recorded, but a means of tracking multiple journeys as a tune travels across textual, print, sonic, and visual media, over space and through time. Simple tune transcriptions from recordings make visible for both songs a dynamic oral performance practice. When all of the when all of the collected data is collated chronologically, multiple stories emerge about songs circulating on multiple paths through multiple social worlds, in some cases even on a global scale. Time constraints dictated the selection of only 4 highlights to share among many observations I've made. Number 1, Ipolei Manu has also circulated extensively over time. It is among the earliest commercial sound recordings of Hawaiian music, and its journey through time crosses 5 dozen recordings from 1904 to 2015. Observation number 2. Ipolei Manu has circulated extensively over space, appearing frequently in published songbooks and recordings produced not only in Hawaii, but beyond Hawaii as well. Number 3. In contrast, Puamele Kule remained largely local to Hawaii. While newspaper announcements of concert programs chronicle the song's recurrence in performance, it has appeared in published songbooks with notated scores only 3 times, and on commercial recordings only 5 times. The first recording was issued in 1928. The remaining 4 recordings were issued between 1975 and 2015. And finally, observation number 4, the transcriptions of tunes on sound recordings testify to a thriving oral performance practice separate from the printed scores. This is a practice I call systematic tune variation, where singers execute episodic variations and even transformations of tunes, only some of which are reflected in notated scores. I turn now to my second toolkit, genealogical analysis. While a tune itinerary tracks a song after its birth, genealogical analysis turns our attention instead towards the conditions of possibility for the material representation of songs in print. As a textual artifact, printed sheet music engages multiple literacies, both of which were cultivated by American missionaries from the start of their mission endeavors in 1820. 4 strategies are relevant here. First, missionaries labored to render the Hawaiian language into the Roman alphabet in order to reach Hawaiian people more effectively through the Hawaiian language rather than English. Second, missionaries taught alphanumeric literacy so that Hawaiians could eventually read the Bible when it was translated. Third, missionaries taught Hawaiians the rudiments of singing so that Hawaiians could experience music as part of worship. And fourth, the missionaries in Hawaii taught and promoted the use of musical staff notation. What emerged by the 1830s was a print culture of Hawaiian language materials by which both alphanumeric and staff notation literacies proliferated, as testified by the quantities of materials produced on the mission presses, carefully logged in the annual reports submitted to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. The print culture of Hawaiian language publications extended into newspapers, especially after 1860, when newspapers, independent of mission and government control, became vehicles for lively reader participation in publicly conducted discourse and debate. Editors and readers alike offered accounts of pre-Christian cultural practices, lifeways, and traditions, including poetic compositions formerly transmitted orally. Readers also submitted newly composed mele, poetic compositions, for which there is much evidence that these textual items were the basis for oral performance. Printed scores in staff notation extended in the late 1860s into newly composed secular songs by Hawaiian songwriters, published occasionally as sheet music arranged for voice and piano accompaniment. The first collection of song scores in one volume appeared in 1899. Over the next century, over 200 songbooks appeared in print. The print culture established in 19th century Hawaii was enabled by alphabetic and musical literacies, which in turn facilitated the consumption of print artifacts that encoded cultural practices, including musical performance. Print culture then constituted a milieu of textual and musical literacy in which the songs Ipo Le Manu and Pua Mele Kule were published as sheet music in 1892. The term hula ku'i under each song title on the cover and also inside under each song title identifies each song with a genre of music and dance whose emergence can be traced through lyrics published in newspapers in the 1860s and 1870s. Ku'i is literally defined as joining old and new, a perfect characterization of indigenous Hawaiian practices of poetic composition, vocabulary, vocal techniques, and dance movement, converging with practices brought from elsewhere, such as harmonized tunes, strummed stringed instrument accompaniment, new dance movements, and new visual conventions of attire and staging. Hula ku'i were performed openly alongside older performance genres at the court of King David Kalakaua, who reigned from 1874 to 1891. Thus, the blending of compositional and performance components were part of a milieu of urban cosmopolitanism manifested by a European-styled monarchy with a nationalist-inspired revitalization of indigenous Hawaiian practices. The thousands of lyrics preserved in archival sources, including newspapers and manuscripts, focus on and around the late 19th century monarchs, their relations, and close associates, while 20th century field recordings collected from rural and remote reaches of the archipelago attest to the widespread reach of hula ku'i repertoire prior to the advent of commercial sound recordings. If print culture and multiple literacies are conditions of possibility for the production of two hula ku'i songs as sheet music, what then does the 1892 appearance of two hula ku'i songs as sheet music signify? The concepts of genealogical succession and gramophone culture provide frameworks for placing sound recordings in relationship to print culture and Hawaiian performance tradition. The technology of sound reproduction altered the nature and context of musical performance and consumption. It enabled the preservation of individual musical performances that were previously unrepeatable moments in historical time. Gramophone culture also enabled the rapid diffusion of music across vast spaces and beyond the lifetimes of musicians. Okay. The tune itineraries for Ipo Le Manu and Pua Mele Kule testify to the thriving oral performance practice of systematic tune variation. Singers perform episodic variations and even transformations of tunes, only some of which are reflected in notated scores. The practice of systematic tune variation manifests across the hula ku'i genre, both prior to and since the oral evidence etched onto sound recordings. In the case of Ipo Le Manu, the publication of a tune in a notated score did not freeze the practice of systematic tune variation. This dynamic can be traced in the tune itineraries of other hula ku'i songs as well, published in the early 20th century. So what you're seeing here is the tune in the 1892 sheet music, the tune of Ipo Le Manu as published in 1913, which is no longer identical, and then as pulled out at random, two verses performed by the artist Cyril Pahinoi. And again, the two verses are not identical in tune. The practice of systematic tune variation in performance practice confirms that the fixed component in hula ku'i songs is the poetic song text. Print media thus has remained key to circulating poetic texts. Gramophone culture captures the oral evidence of systematic tune variation, leaving sheet music to capture isolated moments in time without representing the practice of systematic tune variation. Over the course of the later 20th century, notated scores gradually fell out of favor as sound recordings increasingly rendered notational literacy expendable. Thus, indigenous Hawaiian praxis and agency lie outside the boundaries of print culture. The practice of systematic tune variation is not visible in a single source, but becomes evident when a tune itinerary tracks multiple sources, each of which are individual moments within a stream of activity. Moreover, this kind of source study seeks to tack between repertoire and its sounded performance to reveal the agency that musicians exercise with hula ku'i songs. And one final thought I wish to add on here is that I suggest that language of colonization, resistance, and decolonization is a diversion from what is really our real challenge. And the challenge is locating that indigenous praxis beneath materials and transactions of encounter and honoring the commitment to that praxis into the future. Thank you.
Mahalo nui ku'ulei. Our next presenter is Judith S. Flores, and her presentation is on folk dance and modernity in the Mariana Islands, recreated Chamorro dance in the 21st century. Please take it away, Judith.
Okay, the title of my presentation is Folk Dance and Modernity in the Mariana Islands. And what I'm doing is bringing you up to date. Several of you were in you were kind enough to review the Guam presentation at the 1996 Festival of Pacific Arts in American Samoa, I believe it was. And I asked if you could comment on this, on what you see of the Guam group. Those of you at the time, and I'm sure many of you now know, that Guam had to completely recreate their lost dances. And the Chamorro youth of the 21st century, for example, they live all over the world, and yet they trace their heritage back to their ancestral home in the Mariana Islands through their family bloodlines and villages of their forebears. And many of these youth are second or third generation Chamorro who have never visited their home islands, and yet they long for home. And many of them are finding their way back for short visits or to live for extended periods. Yet the Chamorro expression of their ancient identity began in the 1980s. And this millennial generation was the first to reach maturity based on the knowledge of their ancestry. So Guam had a long colonial history, beginning with missionization with Spanish Catholic missions in 1668. It was taken over from Spain in 1898. Northern Marianas was taken by Japan during the First World War. Guam was occupied by Japan from 1941 to 1944. And we have to remember Germany took over the Northern Marianas in 1898, and Guam remained became an unincorporated territory of the Northern Mariana of Guam. Guam became an unincorporated territory of the US. So it divided our people politically. We are one people across an island chain of 15 islands in a crescent, tropical crescent that directly below the Bonin Islands of Japan. We went through World War II occupied by Japan because Japan had taken over the Northern Marianas during World War I. In World War II, Japan took over Guam as well and occupied our people from 1941 to 1944. U.S. was reoccupied the islands in a series of battles across the Pacific. The Northern Marianas became a trust territory of the U.S. Guam remained a U.S. territory. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that the military security clearance lifted for Guam, and the Japanese returned as tourists to Guam and to the newly related CNMI. Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So this new economic wealth created mass migrations to the US and increased Americanization of Chamorros. There were no jobs at home, and our military government encouraged our people to join the military. So as a result of this, many communities formed near military bases in the United States. And by the 1970s, both at home and abroad, Chamorro youth were very Americanized. They considered themselves a remote suburb of Main Street, USA. They had lost their Pacific identity. So by the 1980s, the US educated Chamorros returned to Guam with heightened political consciousness, and indigenous educators began to initiate programs that taught the Chamorro language in public schools, because our language, the younger generation no longer spoke our language. The teachers from the US hired on contract brought a fresh perspective that included global concern for indigenous rights and interest in minority cultures. And a small group of teachers initiated Chamorro Week celebrations that focused on traditional crafts, food preparation, and fiestas. This increased cultural consciousness sparked student interest in the knowledge and skills of their elders. In 1983, the first History of Guam course was mandated in the secondary schools. For the first time, students could learn about their indigenous history. So our cultural renaissance began, and the first art form that started this renaissance was dance. And 30 years later, after speaking with this group, the study group of the Music and Dance of Oceania, after our conversation and your expressions of where you thought Guam stood in 1996, I am revisiting it and bringing you up to date as to what has transpired. So I thank you all for those initial comments, and they were in my PhD thesis. So the questions I ask are, how have these reconstructed art movements continued and changed? What issues, inspirations, and sentiments continue to drive the movement? And how do the diaspora communities interact with their home islands? And how do the home islands influence and contribute to the movement? The story is told through case studies of contemporary arts and artists in this movement, both in the home islands and in Chamorro communities across the United States and elsewhere. So the first case study that I also talked about extensively in my dissertation is of Francisco Rabone, who began his journey in 1984, returning from college off-island, determined to learn about the lost dances of his heritage. He had, while off-island, he had gravitated toward the Polynesians because they were fellow islanders. And he had been asked, well, what are the dances of your island? And that piqued his interest to a lifelong dedication to reconstructing Chamorro dance. He built choreography on ancient lifestyles as documented in history, in the mostly missionary history documents. He taught a generation of school children Chamorro dances, chants, and songs that he had created through the Arts Council arts and education programs. As his adult students organized their own dance groups, the concept of dance house appropriated the indigenous word guma for house. He was awarded traditional master status in 1990 from the Arts Council, among the first cohort to receive this award. They joined a Polynesian dance group in order to perform to Japanese hotel tourist expectations and gradually added Chamorro dances. They obtained federal, corporate, and local grants to join a European folk dance, IOV, tour in 2001. He published a 200-page full-color dance manual in 2007, funded in part by a grant from the Administration for Native Americans. He now has a coalition of 15 houses in Guam, Northern Marianas, and the US Chamorro communities. Today, Chamorro protocol for official ceremonies requires the chanted blessings of a cultural group. Now, the diaspora Chamorro communities, as I mentioned, formed near US military bases. So the largest Chamorro population is in San Diego. The last census was 44,000 Chamorros residing in San Diego. San Francisco, Long Beach, and there are now more active Chamorro communities growing in Seattle, Tacoma, in Texas, in Florida, and Maryland areas. Chamorros are now helping to organize the San Diego's Pacific Islander Festival, annual festivals on Mission Beach. They're very active in promoting their culture in their diaspora communities. They are reaching global audiences. And this started when the Guam Visitors Bureau initiated Chamorro dance instruction in Japan in order to promote Guam and encourage Japanese to tour Guam, to visit Guam. One particular dance group that arose from this has now celebrated their 10th anniversary. It is headed by Professor Kyoko Nakayama of Tokyo University. She recruits her students from her cultural classes. Some have become lifelong members of a Chamorro dance group, and they visit Guam, they exchange with Guam groups, and they are a guma under Frank Rabone. It is very interesting to visit this group in Japan because you think you never left Guam. Reaching global audiences also involved another dance master, Vince Regis. He organized his group in Etnogefpago and did a lot of traveling with the Guam Visitors Bureau, promoting Guam. And he began entering his group in folk dance competitions, and the groups often placed among the top 3 awards. While adhering to basic dance standards, in Etnogefpago began to incorporate theatrical embellishments, such as gymnastics and elaborate costumes to excite audiences. This group began to join folk dance tours in Europe under the auspices of the Federation of International Dance Festivals, FIDAF, where Vince serves as Oceanian representative. He was awarded master status in 2014 and Guam's folk dance director title in 2013. One of the hallmarks and moments of pride was FestPac 2016 that was hosted by Guam. And it signified that Chamorros were identified as Pacific Islanders. And it was a big deal for us in Guam. We were very happy to host the 27 island nations. And our home delegation included members of the Guam diaspora communities. We had 500 delegates at our own festival. This brings us to the dialectics of authenticity. This has been a constant area of contention among Oceania in general. It has happened in other places where dances have had to be recreated, but nothing as drastically as it had to be done in Guam. Some of the borrowing people felt was very Polynesian. Lately, our groups have they continue to move away from that, but they continue to use movement and of course, Pacific related materials. For facts, the millennial generation has embraced recreated Chamorro dance. They grew up with it. It's part of their life. Artists and activists of the previous generation have presented modern youth with a sense of Chamorro identity that connects them to their ancient heritage. The reconstructed dances of the late 20th century have been practiced for over 30 years. So, are they authentic folk dance? Couple of definitions. Folk dances are perceived as being unself-conscious and dance for internal consumption, that is, for the folk themselves. Dance as performance, on the other hand, is watched by an audience who does not participate. In the case of reconstructed Chamorro dance, we need to ask ourselves if these dancers were ever intended as unself-conscious dancers for the folk themselves. And for this, I used more recent literature on these dialectics, particularly Joseph Feinberg's work in Europe. As the movement progressed through time, dance became more performative and more outwardly directed towards educating and promoting awareness to the public. The second note is the elevation of folk dance to theatrical performance continues. The outwardly directed narrative using an array of techniques designed to capture the attention of the public. Chamorros have succeeded in conveying strong messages of connection to an ancient past, both to their own communities and to the world. But there is another aspect of contemporary Chamorro dance that embodies participatory dance and chant for a very intimate community. And this is what I want to talk about. Participatory embodiment is one of the new terms that is used in the literature. And Vince describes his group dynamics and his group as, and dance groups in general in Guam, as a safe and nurturing environment. Noting that at festivals, rehearsals, and traveling as a group, Chamorro values are practiced. They're practiced by the many parents who transport their children and other people's children who need rides, who always have a food table to nourish all children, geftau, or sharing, while rehearsals are going on, or while waiting their turn to dance. Parents, siblings, and members themselves are weaving body ornamentation from flowers or coconut leaf, or helping a young dancer dress her hair, adjust her skirt. And this is Inafat Maulik, making it good for everyone. In these situations, they will dance and sing for their own enjoyment, punctuated by jokes and laughing. And it is precisely in these social places, which are set up in relative opposition to public performance, that the authentic begins to appear. And this is a statement made by Joseph Feinberg in 2018. So in conclusion, I'd like to restate that reconstructing Chamorro dance has always been reflective due to its own beginnings as reconstruction. Practitioners and folklore lovers like me and hundreds of parents, aunties, uncles, and grandparents bear folklore and consciously choose to enjoy the dances and support its continued movement. When their children have moved on, they will also leave. But the experience, and my experience, has touched all of them. And the Chamorro dance's 30-year history has shown that their children's children will carry on. And I thank you for bearing with me. And I turn it back to you.
Oh, mahalo nui, Judy. All right, so Brian asked me to remind you folks that we will have we'll keep the Zoom open after this panel. We're running a little behind, but that's fine because we don't have anything coming up immediately after. But there will be an informal meet and greet kind of thing after this for those that do want to attend. Also, this will be a great time if any of you have questions for either of the first two presenters. If you could message them to me directly or post them for the group to see so I can get organized when our next presenter is done. So with that, I'd like to introduce our final presenter, Michael Webb, and the topic of his presentation is Island Messiahs, Contexts and Meanings of Handle in the Southwest Pacific. Take it away, Michael.
Thank you. Just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on in the Blue Mountains in Sydney, the Darug people, and like to thank Brian and his team for organising the Remix Symposium, and like to thank my previous co-panel presenters and the chair as well. So Island Messiahs, Context and Meanings of Handle in the Southwest Pacific. This is, just for context, this is a tiny corner of a large project that I've been working on for a couple of years. The larger project is a history of Protestant hymnody in Melanesia, which for me includes Fiji, the Loyalty Islands, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Torres Strait, and looking at 5 mission denominations from 1835 to middle of the 20th century. So, Island Messiahs, Context and Meanings of Handel in the Southwest Pacific. The Hallelujah Chorus from George Friedrich Handel's oratorio Messiah, composed in 1742, is one of the most widely recognizable pieces of Western art music. In the 19th century, it was accorded a high status, especially in Britain. And as Christopher Coburn puts it, everywhere the British went, Handel's oratorio was sure to go. Beyond its specific religious connotations, over time, the Hallelujah Chorus served as a standalone festive item, a finale piece that showed off the talents of its performers. By the early decades of the 20th century, missionaries interpreted the ability of islanders in the Southwest Pacific to successfully render Handel oratorio choruses as a triumph of Christian accomplishment. To British-descended Australians more generally, such performances signified social, cultural, and spiritual uplift. For islanders, they were far more than the manifestation of a strong desire to meet a choral challenge. As the apogee of a widespread earnest commitment to and investment in hymnody and choralism, performances of Handel choruses were also deeply symbolic of the social and cultural renewal processes that had been underway from the years of early contact with Europeans, which decades later culminated in political independence. As early as 1873, an Australian newspaper mentioned Handel's Hallelujah Chorus being performed in, quote, grand style by Samoan and Rotuman church choirs. This was in the context of an argument against over-educating islanders at the expense of European settlers. Europeans' reception of the islanders' peak choral achievement was not entirely straightforward, as such performances were perceived through a racial filter, which in ways to be seen ultimately worked to the islanders' advantage. Such racialization resulted from the rapturous reception by Christian audiences in Australia and New Zealand of the singing of the African-American Fisk Jubilee Singers during their comprehensive tour of 1896 to 1889. Map shows the route of that 3.5-year tour. Twice the Fisk Jubilee Singers visited New Zealand in that 3.5-year period. So, excuse me. And there were also many other Jubilee singing troupes that performed well into the 1920s in Australia and New Zealand. Moreover, there's evidence to support the idea that mastery of such European choral art music was for Melanesian islanders a key indicator of the culmination of the colonization process, a statement that they wished to be free of European political domination. In what follows, I'll explore both of these aspects of Melanesian choralism. To begin, I briefly discuss what I term the FJS effect, or the Fisk Jubilee Singers effect. The FJS effect involved the positive evaluation of the singing of Pacific Islanders in the light of the accomplishment and reception of the celebrated Fisk Jubilee Singers of Tennessee in the United States. Comparing Melanesians to the Fisk Jubilee Singers dates back to 1888, when the London Missionary Society missionary Harry Dauncey newly arrived in Port Moresby from Britain, heard him singing on the mission house veranda and wrote that, quote, "The method resembled that of the Jubilee singers, one girl making the start and the whole party taking up the strain a little later," end of quote. Another notable performance in the rise of the FJS effect occurred when South Sea Islander Handleby, heard on an unidentified Queensland sugarcane plantation in the 1890s, was explained in an Australian newspaper as follows. There's, quote, "Their singing of European hymns is altogether unique and indescribable. One realizes after hearing them where the charm lies in the Jubilee singers' music, that in every plantation song that is really the genuine thing." Then there was the singing of a mission-trained choirs in Rabone, Papua New Guinea. Upon hearing several of these on Empire Day 1928, an Australian resident and musical connoisseur noted that they would, quote, "compare favorably with the famous Negro choirs of America and could perhaps tour the world with equally successful results." As Lawrence Schenbeck explains, the Fisk Jubilee singers forced whites to, quote, "revise their notions of the Negro's potential for civilization." In the Southern Hemisphere, the Fisk Jubilee singers changed the way whites viewed and heard Pacific Islanders. After the touring Jubilee singing troops, Islanders' choral singing, quote, "transformed into sounds within a recognizable cultural and spiritual order," to use the terms of John Cruz. Whites were so convinced of both the vocal and broader symbolic affinity between the Fisk Jubilee singers and Pacific Islanders, especially, but not only those laboring on Queensland plantations, that they began to actually teach them Jubilee songs or spirituals. The Methodist William Bromelow and his wife Lily, for example, thought, quote, "the Negro spirituals would make a strong appeal to the Indigenous folk." And so they introduced them to D'Entrecasteaux Islanders in Papua New Guinea in the 1890s. The Presbyterian mission historian Graham Miller believed that among Ni Vanuatu labourers in Queensland, Jubilee songs, quote, "helped to light a common flame of confidence and liberty for the spirit, if not for the body." And that this in turn helped to, quote, "fashion aspirations for the liberty of their young nation" when they gained political independence in 1980. In 1932, when the Tongan Methodist College Boys Choir was on tour around Australia, the Christian Commonwealth heralded its Adelaide season with a promotional poster that presented 9 interesting facts. The first of these cited a review of the choir's earlier performance in New South Wales, so it was about to perform in Adelaide in South Australia. And the earlier review, the first fact, as you can see at the bottom of the little poster there, Sydney says, "nothing finer in male singing since the Fisk Jubilee singers." End of quote. The 6th interesting fact on the list quoted an audience member at the Sydney concert who wrote, "The rendering of the Hallelujah chorus was the supreme revelation of their splendid musical powers. The harmony reminded one of some of the swelling tones of some great organ played by a master hand. Surely the hand of the divine master touched the heart of those boys as they sang." End of quote. The Methodist sponsors of the tour were confident that sounding like the Fisks, while superbly delivering the Hallelujah chorus, would be a winning combination and a testament to mission progress besides. As a reviewer of a subsequent concert given in Brisbane wrote, there was, quote, "a judicious blending in the choral parts of European and native melody, but whichever was sung, the effect was pleasing. And, quote, "the Hallelujah chorus and other scored pieces call to mind the softening and uplifting influence of Christianity in those islands." End of quote. As Melanesian communities became increasingly competent as hymnodists, and as their accomplishment was acknowledged and celebrated by missionaries and Europeans more widely, both parties sought a new musical model for social and cultural regeneration and transformation. Handel's oratorio choruses were ideally suited for inculcating the kind of racial uplift missionaries had in mind, since they contained powerful cultural resonances, spiritual and secular, and presented a musical challenge that was several steps beyond the most complex European hymn. Melanesians must have sensed this music's strong association with European Christian nationalism, and in effect, by performing it, I contend, declared their desire to found a nation of their own. Here time permits me to only discuss a single case in support of this claim. Missionaries considered Tongans to be more advanced than Melanesians, and their familiarity with the Hallelujah chorus predated that of Fijians and most other Melanesian peoples by several decades. Even so, Loyalty Islanders must have been familiar with the chorus by the 1910s at least, since the missionary James Hadfield reported, quote, "They all understood the tonic solfa system, and their rendering of the Marseillaise and the Hallelujah chorus in particular, just to mention 2 of hundreds of pieces they knew, would be a revelation to Australians if they could hear them performed at any of the great native festivals." So as my table here indicates, Handel performances did not proliferate in Melanesia. Little more than a dozen have been documented, although there's no doubt that many more went unrecorded. The particular performance I now discuss took place at the end of 1943 in the Western Solomon Islands. The first documented performance of Handel in that area took place at the Methodist Mission at Roviana, New Georgia, at Easter 1926. Another performance was reported in 1937 nearby at Gizo in the Western Solomons. The particular performance under discussion was described in a letter written by a New Zealand soldier during the Pacific War from, quote, "somewhere in the Solomon Islands." This is likely to have been in New Georgia or on a nearby island in the Methodist evangelized part of those islands. The context was a concert given the day after Christmas in December 1943 to entertain visiting armed forces personnel. Here's the excerpt from the letter. "Last night there was a concert, mostly sacred. The native choir was there again, as well as our own choir. I think the audience would have liked to have the natives all the time. What do you think they sang? The Hallelujah chorus. They sang it very well too. They also did a few native dances that were very interesting. The Hallelujah chorus was part of a scene depicting the 4 stages of life that they had gone through in the last 40 years. The first part was one of the old war dances to the accompaniment of the chanting of their war song. The old chiefs did dance in their war paint with tomahawks and shields, did the dance. The coming of Christianity was represented by the Hallelujah chorus. Then came the invasion by the heathen armies of the Japanese. When threatened in order to make them give information, the natives used to answer, yes, no, which meant they never told anything. The fourth part was the coming of the Christian armies of liberation, and to depict this, they sang Onward Christian Soldiers to an anthem tune. So 4 concert items are mentioned, which formed part of what was by that time and remains still a Melanesian tradition of the dramatic reenactment of past events of momentous historical significance, most commonly those relating to conversion to Christianity. The anthropologist Jeffrey White writes of a skit performed on Santa Isabel Island in the Solomons that portrays Indigenous catechists struggling to teach the rudiments of hymn singing to a group of villagers. As he puts it, this was one of a series of phases that villagers passed through in the acquisition of Christian identity. The loud and forceful singing of well-practiced hymns, White explains, was meant to represent the transformation of heathen ancestors into contemporary Christian persons. In this wartime version of the skit, the one that I'm reporting on here, that you can see on the screen, Islanders conveyed the distance between their pagan and Christian state, their former and their new identity, by juxtaposing their own customary dance and a piece of European customary music. Fascinatingly, the instance considered here adds a second act to that described by White, one which depicts insubordination to, followed by liberation from an invading imperial power. The centerpiece of the performance was the majestic Hallelujah chorus, which evidently impressed the New Zealand soldier and his comrades. The textual message of the Handel chorus, that the prevailing order is not unshakable, may have been an encouragement to Islanders, not just in the face of Japanese invasion, but ultimately with regard to British imperialism as well. The impact of Islanders' choral hymn singing on white soldiers during the Pacific War reverberated with Fisk Jubilee singers like resonances, reference to a recording and an allusion to a tour in the quote I'm about to supply, in other parts of the Solomon Islands as well. Of a performance heard at Tulangi in 1943, the United States serviceman Jack Poulton wrote, quote, "They sang the church as one foundation with native words and no accompaniment. The choir of about 20 mixed. I was a bit prickly along the back about it all, and I hope I shall be able to remember and wish I could make a record. Wish that I could bring them back with me. People at home who like music ought not to miss it." Handel choruses gained meaning by being performed in association with select anthems. Hadfield's coupling that I mentioned earlier of the Hallelujah chorus and La Marseillaise is a notable example, as is the wartime performance of Handel and Onward Christian Soldiers. Many years earlier, the Western Solomons Methodist Mission founders John Goldie and his hymn translator wife Helena anticipated the formation of a new national moral order in Solomon Islands, one shaped by a Christian imaginary, which they surely must have transmitted to early converts. In 1915, John wrote, quote, "Their characters differ as do their faces. They are from every island in the Western Solomons. The proud Roviana chief sits humbly by the side of his late Isabel slave. The Bougainville man sits by the side of the Vella La Vella man, and nearby are men from La Nua, Tasmans, Choiseul, and elsewhere. One asks for the hymn La Tu Varipera, or Onward Christian Soldiers, and the words are full of deep, deep meaning as they look into each other's faces and sing, in translation, all one body we, one in hope and doctrine, one in charity." End of quote. By the first decade or two of the 20th century, across island and coastal Melanesia, harmonized hymnody had become the sound of the nascent nation. Jean-Marie Chibao, the esteemed Kanak intellectual and independence leader, wrote in the 1980s, "Every country has always been independent. Nationalism only emerges when another nation alienates a people's sovereignty. Today, the aspiration to nationhood has arisen in response to colonization," he says. End of quote. Ingeniously, very early on, Melanesian communities pursued mastery of a key colonial expressive form and began to employ it as a resource for shaping their modern national aspirations. The Jubilee singing of African Americans, such as the Fisk Jubilee Singers, helped missionaries to hear islanders singing with fresh ears and, to varying extents, no doubt, reevaluate their human potential and agency. Performances of hymns and Handel choruses represented the dawning realization among islanders that they belonged to various ethnic, and at the same time were early rehearsals for the establishment, in a not so distant future, of self-governing states. That's it, thank you.
Awesome, mahalo nui, Michael. So we do have time for some questions, and I do have some that were sent to me. To Amy first, do you think that there's been less tune variation as the availability of recordings has increased, or has the importance of the text remained primary?
Or has the importance of the text remained what?
Primary.
Primary. Oh, primary. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Recordings have facilitated the expression of creativity and agency. They have not reduced. They have not limited choice and agency. In fact, the recordings have encouraged it, where singers do their best to put their own personal spin on a song.
Mahalo, Amy. Okay, so this may be our last one, and it's addressing all three of our presenters. So we'll start with Judy, and we'll cycle back to you, Amy. I'm interested to hear from all presenters, if possible, about some of the tensions they may have experienced when revitalizing ancient knowledge and practice, particularly where Christianity is now the cultural framework communities operate in. So Judy, if you could discuss that in the context of your field. You're still muted, Judy.
Thank you for that question. Christianity came so early in the Mariana Islands since 1668. And I don't think tensions, they were so thoroughly Christianized that, you know, the local beliefs persisted underground, but the tension was never evident, and the voices of the Chamorros were not evident. So it's hard to say if there were tensions in the beginning.
Okay. Michael, can we pass that same question to you about tensions experienced when revitalizing ancient knowledge and practice?
In relation to hymnody, it's a bit of a tricky question because hymnody becomes a tradition and becomes traditional. So it's not, this is a much bigger conversation, but it's not really a question of tradition versus modernity in particular here. So yeah, I think that in relation to the sort of things that I'm looking at, I don't think, I mean, the question is much more complex than before and after and this or that. I think it's both and.
Amy, and you, please.
Michael, I love that. It's both and. That's precisely where I would like to head. Tensions come from all directions. It's not, there are tensions from outsiders passing judgment. There are tensions from insiders weaponizing judgment against each other. And there are tensions when expertise comes into play and then begins to flex its own set of values and ideologies of what something should be as opposed to what people want to make it to be. So revitalizing ancient knowledge and practice, I'm now falling along the lines of revitalizing means you still have a framework of relating to it in such a way that it becomes yours.
Awesome, mahalo, Amy. So Brian, we are at 20 after. I have two specific questions. Do we have time or should we wrap it?
If there are any more questions anyone has, perhaps a last call for questions.
Okay, well, I do have two. One Judy answered in the text, the other she hasn't, so I'll pass that one. I'm sorry, no, this is for Michael. For Messiahs in the Pacific, is there any commentary on the vocal quality used?
This is a big area, particularly, and I'm talking, even though I did mention Tonga, I'm really confining my own work to the Melanesian Islands. And I mentioned Tonga because the Tongan precedes Messiah performances in the area. It really moves from Tonga to Fiji and then to New Britain and so forth. But everywhere, so their main Messiah performances occur mainly in Methodist evangelized areas, although there is the London Missionary Society as well in the Loyalty Islands earlier. But there are very interesting and detailed descriptions at various levels of detail of all of the different of the performances in different areas. So you get descriptions of Solomon Islands performances that are different from in terms of the textures and the timbres of voices that are different to the way they're described in Fiji and the way they're described in the Solomons and Rabaul as well. So there is some detail on that. I mean, these are observations in passing by people who were usually commenting on other things. So they're relatively brief, but it is possible to build a picture of what we were hearing. And I probably didn't leave that slide on long enough, but the one that has the table of the different performances that I've found, documented performances that I've come across through a pretty meticulous search. There's a lot of commentary on whether they were singing, what language they were singing in, whether they were singing from tonic solfa, or whether they were singing unaccompanied, or whether they learned from phonograph recordings and whose recordings they were imitating, and that kind of thing as well. So there's much more detail that I could have talked about, but of course, time is a factor.
Mahalo, and I'll throw this one to Judy. She did answer it in the chat, but it's scrolled off screen, so perhaps some missed it. So Judy, has there been any indigenous categories, emic term for people's dance among the Chamorro people?
There hasn't, I don't have a particular, am I muted? No, I'm not.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, I don't have a particular, or I'm not aware of a particular emic term for the word dance. The guma, which is an emic term for house, each guma still calls their dancer or their dance baila, which is a Spanish word. But there is a tendency in the movement to go back to ancient terms, emic terms, and they do have a very extensive lexicon for movements of the dance that they have created.
Keola, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I need to run next door and produce a recording session. So I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our participants in this. Appreciate your attendance and the thoughtful questions. Wish I could hang out with you afterwards and get to know a few of you a little better, but I will try to check in over the weekend, more recording going on tomorrow. So mahalo nui, hui ho kako.
Mahalo, Keola.
Thank
you
you
very much.